Hi, Jeannine. Thank you so much for joining us today. For the audience, we're speaking with Jeannine Rashidi today. She'll be talking about her book as well and sharing a little bit about her past and her current state and how she's doing and how she's bringing awareness to trauma and how to move beyond it. The title of her book being Abundance Beyond Trauma, Discovering Your Courage for Change and Commitment to Yourself. And really, just loved connecting in with what you had to say in your book. A lot of it really resonated with me and how you view connecting in with your own traumas and experiences and how you share yourself so vulnerably and openly and freely with your clients and your family and friends and the community. So I'd just like for you to give a little bit of background, high level for, or however that works for you, however you're comfortable, and to talk about how your journey led you to this point to write this book and how you got into Ayurvedic medicine as well.
Thank you, Jess. It is an honor to be here with you. So, my journey began with the first 25 years of my life, experiencing severe mental, emotional, physical, psychological, and sexual abuse. So, my parents, they were not well. And so some of the abuse, came from them. And when I realized that I was in a situation that I needed to get out of, I was about 14 years old actually, when this thought came that I need to get away from this situation. Now, being that I was a straight A student in school, I had teachers who were great at supporting me and helping me get involved with all the extracurricular activities so that I was not as home as often. But by the time I got into high school, I was questioning, where are the classes that help you deal with what's happening at home? And there wasn't anything in the curriculum. And I had depended so much on school for a lot of my emotional support, psychological support. And so I felt at a loss. And I also didn't really know who to talk to about this sort of thing. And so I felt it was better to basically leave home. So even though I was destined to, probably get a full scholarship, maybe even go to medical school, I didn't feel that staying for that period of time was something that I could do. Anything was going to be better than the situation I was in. And so I successfully ran away from home at 15. And I say that because there were other attempts. And then I always had to come back home. So, you do something enough, you figure out, okay, now I know how to do it correctly. So I ran away from home at 15 and I hitchhiked about 400 or 500 miles down south into Southern California, and I learned how to live homeless. And that was a fascinating experience. I met many Vietnam veterans who could relate with. And I didn't know at the time what PTSD was, but I was obviously observing a lot of it through them. And what was interesting was watching them and how they dealt with it. And they dealt with it through addiction, whether it was drinking or drugs, and it was a way for them to cope.
Yeah,
And during that time,
my dad was a Vietnam vet. He was there from age 19 to 21, and he had addiction issues as well. He was just, and I say that because I'm very passionate about working with veterans, and I really love sharing sound healing with them. So when I read that in your book, I was really excited that you had that knowledge, and that was something that you learned from and brought into your practice as well around PTSD.
yeah. Well, and what it did was it created a questioning of what could my parents have possibly been going through that made them want to do so many drugs, drink so much, things like that. So it gave me a very different perspective. And then during that time of, living homeless and learning where the soup kitchens were, where to sleep so that I didn't get caught by the police and have to go back home. I met a man who was 17 years older than I was, and he, seemed to be on the same path of wanting to not follow in the parents' footsteps, and he obviously came from abuse. And he was also the first man to tell me that he loved me. And since I was so starved for that love, I instantly believed it. And this veil of ignorance, I will say, came over me at like a fantasy that, okay, everything's going to be fine now because my knight in shining armor has shown up. He's told me he loves me. So that's all that you really need.
Yeah.
And that's from the perspective of a 15-year-old.
Yeah. Falling in love with that potential as well.
Right. And so come to find out, he himself was, and still is, an addict. Same drug that my parents used, which was methamphetamines. And each time, he would say that he was going to quit, I believed him. And during that time, I became pregnant. First pregnancy, I lost, I think 2 months in. And then the second time I got pregnant, obviously there was no birth control happening. The second time I got pregnant, that was a full pregnancy. And that whole relationship, all the way to my daughter being born, it already had so much abuse happening on every single level. But because I was still underage at 17, now giving birth, I had no choice at this point but to go home. Because once you're in the system, you've got to follow those rules. So yeah. I ended up back home, and I took her father with me, and we ended up actually getting married. And you might be asking yourself, well, why on earth would I marry this person? Well, you have to understand, I also went back into another hell. So from my perspective, I actually felt safer with him, bringing him back to this hell. And then there was so much other stuff going on at home, which included, drugs happening all over the place.
Yeah.
And I did not want to be living at my parents'. And I did also have the fantasy that if I marry, then again, we're going to live happily ever after. So obviously from 15 to 17, which is when I gave birth, not much intelligence had developed yet around that particular topic.
Yeah.
So yeah, we got married.
Well, the examples you had weren't, very helpful either.
Right. And then I ended up pregnant again and had my second daughter at right before I turned 21. So I had 2 children under the age of 21. And it took me 10 years, so from the age of 15 to 25, to realize that this situation's not going to change. It's only getting worse. I was the sole provider because he was feeding his addiction. And at some point, I noticed that my children started having the same behaviors that were all too familiar to me. And as I dug deeper, it became clear that they were now the victims of the same type of abuse that I had gone through. And this wasn't supposed to happen. I was supposed to leave home, start a better life, but that's not what happened. And the reason that didn't happen is because I had not healed from the trauma of my upbringing yet. And because I hadn't, I ran away from home as a victim. My mindset was that of a victim. Now, yes, I was 15, but I don't like to use that as an excuse, but definitely we do need to take into consideration I was still a child.
Of course.
But this child still had this victim consciousness. And when you have victim consciousness, you naturally will attract a perpetrator, because in order to be a victim, there has to be a perpetrator. And in order for there to be a perpetrator, there has to be a victim. So while my conscious intention was not to be in that place, the unconscious and subconscious had not processed the trauma, was still in victim mindset, and therefore attracted the same thing into my life. And that's how it ended up repeating itself with my daughters.
Yeah, the opportunities that the universe gives us as we move through the different lessons and the different experiences that we came here to understand for ourselves and for the collective and creation, right? And then we get stuck in the cycles and we don't realize it until one day there's a moment where we have this aha awakening and we go, we're here to change this. We're not here to continue the cycle. We're here to change it. And then we have the ability to choose with that awareness to do something different.
Right. Well, and it was when I realized, okay, I'm in the same type of situation. I got to figure out how to get out. And by this time, I had already made quite a few attempts of leaving, but I was not successful. And so there became a point where he figured out how I could not have both children alone at the same time, knowing I'm not going to leave one of my children behind.
Wow.
So he would leave during the day, take the only car that we had, and I had quit my job to be at home to observe and keep the children safe. So while he was out doing what he was doing, I found Stephen Covey's book, or Stephen Covey's book, excuse me, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. I came across this book because I was in a marketing job at the time. And I just started opening it up and reading it. And this book had such a profound impact on my state of being and my ability to think about my life and to master myself. I had never heard of this concept before, and it drew me in, and I just knew I need more of this. And so I was no longer worried or even thinking about what is my husband doing, because while he's gone doing whatever he's doing, this is what I'm going to be doing. And that book was actually how I developed and discovered my own courage to change my life, to change the cycle of dysfunction, and to figure out how to leave that situation.
So it gave you the opportunity to shift your focus too from him and just surviving to you and how you were going to thrive after.
Right. Because when you're in a state of trauma, you're often just triggered all the time. So here I am triggered all the time, wondering what's he doing? Who's he with? Is he going to bring home some sort of like STD, etc.? And instead, now my focus was, okay, I've got to figure out how to get out of here. I need to figure out how to not fall into this cycle again. And my daughters and I need counseling for sure. So it took quite a bit of planning to figure that out. I reference, how that all went down in the book, and I'll save that for the readers. But it was very intense experience. But when it finally happened, the thought that I had when we finally were in the quote unquote getaway phase was, who's going to take care of him? Which is a really dysfunctional thought when you hear it. And yet, for those of us who have ever been in this situation, you know this because you've learned to be okay with something that is not healthy. You still care about this person, and yet it's not healthy. And so I just want to make sure to say that, because until you're willing to acknowledge your own thoughts and how you truly feel, only then can you change it.
Yeah, I totally
But
agree.
if I would have pretended like I never had that feeling, I would be lying to myself, and I wouldn't be willing to see where am I at. So, the only place I could go at that point, because I didn't have money saved, any money that I tried to save, he got a hold of. And so I had to go back home. Now, at this point, my parents had, it seemed like they had cleaned up and were getting counseling. So I was hopeful and yet very cautious, knowing that I need to make use of the situation as best as I can and then try to move out as quickly as possible. So, I moved in with my parents, and I immediately needed to find a different career, one where I could create my own hours, and saw an advertisement on TV. There were 2 options. One was massage therapist, the other one was a mechanic. And I considered both of them.
That's
At this
awesome.
point, even though I was a straight A student, all I had was my GED basically.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, okay, I could do either. I was open to either. But then I thought about what my hands would look like, as a mechanic. And I thought,
Yeah.
let's try the massage thing.
Much softer as a massage therapist than as a
Right,
mechanic.
right. So I did get a sales and marketing job because I already had that experience. And so I would go to school from 6 a.m. to 10 a.m. I would work from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. I would come home, have dinner with the kids, and then a few months into my massage training, I was actually already giving massages in the
Mhm.
evening to make some extra money. And so within 18 months, I was able to move out, get my own place. I started my own practice, and it was quite scary
Yeah. How
because I
was
had
it?
never,
Sorry about that. How
that's
was
okay.
it living with your parents for those 18 months?
There were some really sweet moments. There were some really dysfunctional moments.
Mhm.
It became pretty clear not during that point. It took a couple more years after that for me to realize, because there was a pattern happening with them too. Clean for a while, falling off the wagon,
Yeah.
you know, and it would be so extreme. Like all of our family, anything from our family history would end up in storage. Storage wouldn't get paid because that money would be used for the habit, and
Yeah.
then everything's just gone. So there were a lot of experiences of having things and losing things.
Hmm.
Parents are there, they're doing their best, and then all of a sudden they've fallen off the wagon. So this happened enough times, and there was a situation where my children were actually involved, and they witnessed something, and that's when I decided, that's it, I'm done.
Yeah.
And that was when I decided that this is not possible. Until you're willing to be healthier, I cannot put my children in that, place.
Yeah.
And that was that. And that was the last time that I had any interaction. And that, to this day, I think it's been about 12 years now.
Yeah, when I was 17, I moved out. It was a mutual get the fuck out, and I wanted the fuck out. And it wasn't because they were abusive. It was just this really interesting urge inside of me to be autonomous and to be on my own. The trauma I experienced was being diagnosed with Crohn's disease and colitis when I was 14, and then going
Wow.
through all these different changes and being already, in puberty and feeling different and weird and awkward and not really feeling like I fit in anywhere, to now I have this medical condition. Now I'm really not like everyone else and taking all these meds that made me look different too. And then I moved out, and that's when I incurred the physical, sexual abuse as well, and just emotional stuff with different partners. And one of the partners I lived with, he was not physically abusive. It was more of just emotionally, just not mature enough to be in that space with me. And when I turned 30, it was very dysfunctional. I was actually on disability, like couldn't walk and was having crazy, symptoms and dis-ease. And my mom came to me one day and she just said, my husband and I don't really want any of you kids living with us, because there was two stepdaughters and me and my sister. And she said, but Dave and I talked, and we want you to come stay with us for as long as you need to get back on your feet and to also finish your degree. Because I had been going to school, and at that point I had been laid off and didn't know what I was going to do. I went to cosmetology school, and then I was like, oh, but that's not how I'm going to be in service either. Okay, great. What do I do now? And
Right.
so living with her for that year, living with her and my stepdad, was really beautiful for me to connect with her again, because the last time I lived with her, it was a very different experience. And I really appreciated that year. And it was really healing for us. And we have a different relationship now. It's not as uh, gentle or kind as it was during that year. And I also look back on that year with a lot of gratitude, just for the space to be myself and to get back on my feet, and then launch from that healthy foundation that I had created for myself.
I think it's really important that we remember good times. The mind is really good at remembering the not so good times.
Yeah.
So I had a memory that came up not too long ago, where a friend had sent me a picture of a birthday party that they had thrown for me. And I noticed I was wearing a shirt. And my mother, she's very creative. She had made this shirt, and I noticed the earrings I was wearing were earrings that her and I had made together. And so it was this very bittersweet moment of really appreciating the positivity of that part of her. Because if you can recognize that not each person has different aspects. People, I don't believe, are all 100% unhealthy, unwell, diseased, whatever the term is you'd like to call it. So I think it's important to acknowledge, I don't hold anything against my parents, and I do try to find the positive and appreciate that with full open eyes and awareness of the
Yeah.
current state of being.
Yeah, that awareness thing is tricky sometimes. I like how you also talked about with Stephen Covey's book, how it helped you to realize what self-awareness was for you for the first time, and how you were able to dive into that. And I feel like that also may have been part of the connection with your heart mind disconnect or connection. And maybe you could share a little bit about that as well, and what that is for you.
So the awareness of the heart and mind, that didn't come till much later,
Okay.
consciously. Although I was aware that I was continually in a triggered state in that first marriage. And then coming out of that and trying to, start my life over, I was very, very emotional. And at the time, I felt that that was a weakness, that my children had already experienced so much dysfunction that I didn't want them on a daily basis to see me breaking down, even though that's exactly what was happening.
Yeah.
And so I learned to put on this mask, this face that mom's fine, everything's great, mom can do it all. And on the inside was, really a total mess. And the reason I want to make sure to say that is because looking back, and I think I referenced this in my book, when we put on that mask that we're okay when we're really not, even with our children, now you have to be age appropriate, of course, but I really feel strongly that we need to be open and honest with how we express emotion, because how do our children learn these things? They learn it from us.
Yes. They're not learning it in school, that's for sure.
No. And so if here I am raising two daughters on my own, and I'm giving this impression that anything is possible. If you get knocked down, you stand up again, but there's not much feeling, there's not much heart in that. And in that way, I feel for that period of time, I failed them in the heart. Why? Because I was disconnected from my own heart. So until I could come into resonance and acceptance and honor my heart and my feelings, only then can I be available to others. And that is why I emphasize that the relationship with yourself is the most important relationship before you can have any other relationship. So this heart-mind connection is something that is also referenced in Ayurveda, where Charaka says that the seat of consciousness resides in the heart. So when we assess a mind dis-ease, we know that it is originating in the heart. It is circulating throughout the bloodstream, through all your cells. And so we look at it very differently than the Western perspective. And so for me and my experience, once I became aware of how I was holding my own heart hostage, I didn't want to be hurt again. So I created all of these great mental barriers, solid steel walls. Nobody's going to get in. Nobody's going to know all of me. And I felt like a true warrior, like, yeah, okay, I got it down. Nobody's going to get in. Well, that meant that I was also holding my own heart hostage. So
Yes.
I couldn't come out either. So all those skills that kept me safe for that first 25 years, I had to undo all of that. I had to unlearn what I had learned. And through that
how did
process, go ahead.
how did that start? The unlearning process. How did you start taking down those walls?
Well, first you have to be aware that you've got walls up. I did a lot of observing others, noticing how others could connect and easily have emotion, and noticing how I couldn't remember the last time I had cried. So I went from extremely emotional to completely closed up. And so it was through interacting with others, different workshops of, coming into the heart, holding space, noticing how other parents were with their children, healthy parents with their children, and noticing, oh, I want that. And since I didn't have a good outline for, how to parent, I was really kind of doing it all by, I
Trial
knew
and
what
error.
not to do. Right. I knew what not to do. I had to figure out what to do. And so I did a lot of just observing. I would watch shows and be like, okay, yeah, I like how that character did that.
Mhm.
And then self-reference. Well, what does that look like for me? And then just noticing how I was in my relationships. I was only willing to go a certain depth, and then that was it. And then trying to be brave enough. So I just started sharing with some of my closer friends, hey, I'm working through this and it feels really scary and I want to be vulnerable. So I'm telling you that this is something I struggle with. And if you happen to notice, would you be willing to call me out on it?
That's awesome.
you know, and I do highly recommend that because people who deeply care about you, they want you to be the best version of yourself.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
And being vulnerable, we realize as we become more self-aware and we as we heal more, we realize that vulnerability is a superpower, it's a strength, and it really helps us and allows us to tap into how we wish to move forward in a more positive and loving way, and to really start envisioning that. Um,
Yeah.
is that about the time that I'm just curious to know your I'm triggered pocket guide, the 10 steps that you list in your book? I really like
Right.
that process. And I related a lot to it. In the book that I wrote a couple years ago, the little book of tools, I had they were all tools. They were exercises that I had learned from going to different workshops and working with different teachers and masters and shamans. And as you know, when you start to put that message out to the universe, people start to show up. And it almost
Right.
seems magical at first because it never happened before. And now all of a sudden, all the answers and the people are showing up, and you're just like, wow, where were you before? And the universe is like, well, you didn't ask. You weren't listening. And then people start to show up, and you start to realize, like, wow, this stuff really makes sense to me. And I notice if I practice these very simple things, that I can change my environment. So
Right.
how far into when you wrote this book, I mean, what part of your journey were you at in creating that 10-step program process?
That's a really good question. So the first three steps of the 10 were pretty basic. You know, don't make any, the first one is to stop and don't make any decisions. So when I would be triggered, I would have this burst of adrenaline, and then I would want to start doing. Well, everything that I was doing was from a triggered place, which meant any action I took, any conversation I had was coming from a limited perspective of being triggered. And depending on what the trigger was, I could have easily made decisions that completely changed my path in life.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I think the first step is the most important, is to stop, don't make any decisions. So that was more through trial and error, just noticing, wow, when I get triggered, I do things. I probably shouldn't do things. That doesn't happen during the trigger. You think about it after, you know, like, what was I thinking? Well, I wasn't thinking. I couldn't think. The
Mm-hmm.
thinking capacity was turned off.
Yes.
So I always remember, just stop. And that's going to be the hardest because every part of you wants to fight, flight, or freeze.
Mm-hmm.
Then the second one was to make sure that I was being present. And so this locate, I remember I was with a friend, and it was many years ago. And she said, Jeannine, let's do a locational. And I was like, what is a locational? Walked around, and she just said, notice the birds, notice the flower. And we just started locating things in the environment. And that's when I realized this is how you become present. You
Mm-hmm.
get connected with nature. So that's where the second step came in, was to locate, keep the eyes moving. I had done enough of my own inner work to know that because I tended to either freeze or fight,
Mm-hmm.
and of course I was really good at fleeing and leaving. Um, Locating keeps the eyes moving and then gives your mind something to do. Oh, I see a bird, I see a plant. Oh, I feel the air. And as you get connected with that consciousness, you
Mm-hmm.
become more present. And then identifying who my well-wishers were. Well, in that moment, that was my friend. You know, she could tell. It was one of the last interactions I had had with my mother, actually. And she happened to be there, and she noticed my state of being. I did not notice my state of being. It can
Mm-hmm.
get really tricky, especially around family. You're less aware of your own stuff, and
Yeah.
yet acutely aware of your own stuff in the same way. It's weird. But identifying your well-wishers. Why? Because then it reminds you, one, you're not alone. You do have people that can help you, and it will ease you and bring you back to a place of calm. Generally, when you think of who are my well-wishers, who are the people who will support me.
That's amazing. Yeah.
And then
I've
the other steps were the adhere process.
mm-hmm.
And that was the process that, has come into fruition over the last 18 years of experience on how do you actually heal from a trigger. And so through my trauma experience, what I became keenly aware of is, okay, the mother relationship is so vital to growth. The father relationship is so vital to growth. So what happens when you either don't have that, or you have such a dysfunctional set of parents? You have to figure out how to then give it to yourself. Otherwise, you end up searching for it. So you end up searching for that mother or that father, and that ends up being through a friendship or a relationship. That in itself is dysfunctional. We
Yes.
don't want our, partners or spouses playing those roles for us.
Yes. Yeah. And then we end up attracting what we are really not wanting to experience again, which is helpful and not helpful at the same time, because it helps us to move through the patterns that we're practicing. And it also keeps us in the patterns that we're practicing. And so
Yeah.
there's that interesting balance that we find in between as we are becoming more self-aware and processing through it. And like you said, like finding allies, noticing our allies and then reaching out to them, and noticing also, there's another thing you said in your book also that said about who you were surrounding yourself with. At one point, you realized that there were a lot of survivors around you and that you were wanting to get out of that survivor mode or that survivor mindset, and
Mm-hmm.
that you chose to start surrounding yourself with people who were thriving and going where you wanted to go or doing what you were wanting to do. And I really appreciate that as well, because that really is a helpful thing to remember. And I had something happen this last week that I wrote about in the newsletter when I was sharing that I'd be posting the podcast with you this week. And it was about, because I had actually woken up at about 4 o'clock this morning and couldn't go back to sleep. So I was reading some of the book, and I had written the newsletter, but I had it scheduled to go out at like 8 o'clock this morning. And I got up at 4 and I started writing more because I realized I was missing some things, and it had come from your book and from that part of surrounding yourself and noticing who you were surrounding yourself with, and then asking yourself why. And that's the part I wasn't asking myself these last few weeks in my own space here. And then being vulnerable to share that too, and understanding that the more we share about our own personal space and our own personal experience, the more we give permission to others that may not feel as comfortable. Before we got on the call today, I was listening to Glennon Doyle's podcast. She wrote Untamed. Have you read that
Mm.
book?
I have not.
You've got to read that book. It's amazing. Do you know who Glennon is?
I don't.
So Glennon is an author and brilliant, just a brilliant storyteller and speaker. And she was married to a man for many years. They had 3 children. And then she met this woman who was a famous soccer player, Abby Wambach. And they met at a book function because they had both written books, and it was a bunch of the authors had gotten together. And they met and they started having this love affair over email and on the phone. And she realized very quickly that she was not wanting to be with a man anymore. And that's probably not where she belonged in the first place. And so they have a podcast now where her and her wife now, Abby, will talk about what they're experiencing in their life. And her sister, Glennon's sister, is on there as well. And today they were talking about sex and how we are not really intimate with our partners, right? We have sex with them, but we're not really expressing what turns us on, what's an activator, what numbs us, what turns us off. And we just go through the motions, a lot of us, because that's what we're shown in society. And I feel that that's all trauma based as well, because of what we learned through our parents and how they were emotionally demonstrative or not, and how they were when they were. So I really appreciate your vulnerability today, being here and sharing, and in your book, so beautifully written, and sharing about how you have healed and how it has worked for you, because we have 8 billion plus people on the planet. And statistically, there's obviously going to be people that are going to be able to relate to you and your story and the process that you're sharing to help them move out of trauma and post-traumatic stress. And I'm really grateful that you were courageous to share your story. At this point on your path and in your journey, you are a person in the wellness community. You've been practicing for 18 years. What are the communities that you're most passionate about right now, and who do you feel most fulfilling when you're in service with?
Oh, I love that question. So I love conscious communities. So people who are looking to better themselves, essentially, not stay in the victim mindset.
Mm-hmm.
So that could be a wide range of anything. As far as clients, it's the same thing. If you notice on my website, I have different packages that imply, I think the first one is the courageous caterpillar.
Mm-hmm.
And that one is basically for the one who knows that they are going to be transforming, but they're not quite ready to be a butterfly. Like, and then the second one, um, I can't remember, I think it's the courageous healer.
Mm-hmm.
They're ready to dive into things, but they're a little afraid,
Yeah,
and then the third one is like the wellness warrior. So it's giving people an idea that this can be a gradual process.
totally.
But I've always felt since I began my practice where I went from massage, then I went to more traditional, specialized body work, where it was a much more conscious approach. The client, doesn't have to remove their clothing. We're working on posture and strength and self-treatment
Mm-hmm.
so that there's not so much dependency on the practitioner. And then from there, brought in a lot of the mental, emotional type of processing, trauma work, and then the Ayurvedic medicine. So
Yeah.
I've always wanted a more conscious approach because what my journey has shown me is that the dependency is what can actually become a problem. It can
Mm-hmm.
become a dysfunction if you're not careful. So making sure that I am the type of health and wellness practitioner that says, hey, I have a revolving door clientele. I don't want to be profiting from your pain. However, I want to be here as a facilitator. So as long as I am a facilitator that is helping awaken the healer within, this is a conscious approach and you're moving forward. But the
Yeah.
moment it becomes stagnant and it's just this continuous, like, oh, you come in, whatever the treatment is, and then you leave and there's not much improvement, that doesn't feel like progress to me. And at that point, it's actually my responsibility, I feel, to say, hey, I don't think I'm the right practitioner for you.
Mm-hmm.
Or we need to discuss, is there a block that we haven't looked at that's preventing this from moving forward?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Um, do you feel, well, I feel like the answer is yes. Do you feel that you're living your purpose now and that you have, or that you have been? And is there a word that describes it for you right now in this moment?
I do feel like I'm living my purpose. Um, Writing the book took a lot of courage, and I found it fascinating. The day I started writing was September 11th, a huge day of trauma.
Yes.
The book came out, was published right before Memorial Day, another day of
Yes.
trauma. But the universe is so serendipitous, and I've learned to really get excited and kind of chuckle and giggle at how serendipitous it is. So I do feel like I'm living my purpose, and it's clear when I've done something or I'm moving in a direction that's not in alignment with that, because I literally feel an energy drain. I'm not happy anymore. I'm not feeling like what I'm doing is worthwhile. So my whether it's my higher self or my innate healer, I get those signals that are very clear. This is not what you need to be doing on your
Mm-hmm.
path. So I do feel like I'm living my soul's purpose. And the word that I would describe, which is actually how I came up with the title, it would be abundance, because abundance is the opposite of scarcity.
Mm-hmm.
And I've had scarcity from, whether it's a lack of love, lack of nourishment, lack of money, living homeless. There are many aspects of life where it is easy to fall right back into a scarcity mindset of not enough. And when we live like that, we are sending out that signal to bring in scarcity. Versus if we are open to all of the abundant possibilities, and what's coming to mind is the chapter where I talk about the what if. That what if is often the associated with trauma, because we're constantly thinking of, well, what if this happens and what if that happens, but it's more in the negative. But what if we turned it around?
Mm-hmm.
And we could look at it more positively. So trust has always been one thing that I continually find deeper layers with, that I'm working on. And I'm working on building up the Abundance Beyond Trauma workbook. And so as I was going through it, I noticed the what if worksheet, and I was like, oh yeah, I do have some stuff to work on. And so I took some post-it notes and I started writing, what if I trusted? What if I trusted? I put it on my iPhone so that everywhere I look, it keeps giving me that signal. What if I trusted, to remind me that my unconscious and subconscious still has that what if, but in a negative. What if I'm betrayed?
Mm-hmm.
What if this doesn't work out? Versus, well, what if I just trusted that the universe got my back?
Yeah.
And when I feel like I'm trusting, so many more blessings come my way.
Yeah, of course. When
Yeah.
we trust, I like that. I like that reframe of the what if. And trust has been something that's been coming up for me as well. Since I moved to Austin a few months ago, I started seeing a chiropractor who does network spinal care, which is not a
Mm.
typical adjustment. They call it entrainment. So they're entraining the body by touching different parts. And it's basically a touch. Like she describes it by checking the firmness of a tomato. And that's basically the touch that she'll give at different parts of the body along the spine. And then your body really starts to move itself and actually adjust itself as she is suggesting to those different points of the body. And there was some things that came up this last week about trusting in relationships. And really it's about trusting myself and my intuition when something comes up and I go, "Oh, I don't know if that feels right for me. What is that?" And instead of going along with it, stopping, like your first step in your process, and looking at it and going, "Okay, well, wait a second. There's nothing I need to do right now. Let's just pay attention to how I'm feeling right now about trusting and relationships. How does that feel? Because to this point, previous relationships have not been healthy, or they've not been filled with much trust because I wasn't shown that. I was shown to people please and to take care and nurture and give back until I'm depleted, because that made me, the best martyr I could be, and and gave me permission to stay there. And
Yep.
so it was, helpful to be in that martyr space, to be in the victim mode too, and that just perpetuated more. And so then getting into another relationship would just be this, oh, well, we're here again. How do we get here again? And okay, well, and I'm still experiencing this, 45 years later, after like 30 years of dating. Why is this coming up now? And it's, instead of looking at it that way, it's like, okay, well, what if I looked at this as this opportunity? This moment to shift that perspective and to move out of this uncomfortable situation more quickly than letting it drag on for days, weeks, months, years, because we know how that works out.
Relationships are amazing at bringing up everything that is unresolved. I think that's the beauty of the deeper, intimate relationships.
Yeah.
And when you can finally, realize that your ability to trust someone actually has more to do with how well you trust yourself, to make a decision that works best for you, to have that courageous conversation that feels uncomfortable, to ask that uncomfortable question or to show that vulnerability. Hey, I'm feeling insecure. I really feel like being in relationship is actually something that's amazing and beautiful, and one of the hardest things that I've ever done.
Absolutely. It's what helps
Yeah.
us to grow, evolve, and expand and ripple out into this universe and community. And it's also what can be debilitating and crippling at the same time.
Yeah. But again, you have to trust yourself to be able to fully observe with open eyes what is actually happening here. And is it you? Is it them? Do you
Mhm.
need to have a conversation, have some alone time? It's really about learning to honor yourself.
I agree.
Yeah.
Is is there anything else that you'd like to share today? Any one last thought or feeling?
There's a phrase that I used in my book, and people keep referencing it, and it is pretty powerful. And I'd like to just say it, and that is, wounded people wound others when they haven't tended to their own wounds. And I don't mean that you will consciously do it. It is a byproduct of what happens when you're not connected with your heart. So let that be the motivation for you to continue working on yourself, because healthier relationships, they begin with you. When you're healthy, you naturally will attract healthier relationships. The family unit can become healthier. Your social dynamic will be healthier, which means the communities will be healthier. And then as those communities heal, they go out into the world, and it's a domino effect.
Yeah.
But it begins with you. So until we're willing to look at ourselves, true change is not really going to happen because it's always going to have this taste of woundedness, dysfunction, dis-ease behind it.
Agreed. Thank you for
Yeah.
sharing that. And then how can people reach you and find you? Share your information.
Yeah. So you can find me at goodbyetension.com. You can also pick up a copy of Abundance Beyond Trauma. My contact information is there as well. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your time and space and your energy today, Jeannine. It was a pleasure being with you.
Yeah. It was a pleasure talking with you too, Jess.
Take care.